Robert Kraft is expected to face 2 counts of soliciting prostitution, with a warrant for his arrest coming as early as today. Police in Jupiter, Florida say they have video of Kraft in the act as part of an 8-month police investigation into human trafficking. The spokesman for Kraft and the Patriots released a statement saying, quote, "We categorically deny that Mr. Kraft engaged in any illegal activity. Because it is a judicial matter, we will not be commenting further." Let's bring in out Florida State Attorney Dave Aronberg of Palm Beach County, whose office leads a human trafficking task force with the FBI. Also with us, former Assistant United States Attorney in the Southern District of New York, Mimi Rocha. She's also a distinguished fellow in criminal justice at Pace School of Law and an MSNBC legal analyst. Also, Chief National Correspondent for the New York Times Magazine, Mark Leibovich. He is, of course, the author of Big Game, the NFL in Dangerous Times. So, Dave, let's start with you as state attorney that's going to be handling this case. What can you tell us about the status of the prostitution case against Robert Kraft? And also, if found guilty, what sort of time does he face?
Yeah, the Jupiter Police Department, they've completed their investigation, and they have sent the files to my office for review. I expect that we'll be done with our review, and we'll make a filing decision either today or tomorrow. In Florida, solicitation of prostitution is subject to a first-degree misdemeanor, subject to up to 1 year in jail, also a $5,000 fine, 100 hours of community service, and a mandatory class on prostitution and human trafficking.
I want to talk about the human trafficking side of this. Obviously, a big sting operation up and down the coastline. How expansive was the human trafficking operation, and how did you catch wind of it?
Well, this has been an ongoing effort. A lot of different agencies were involved. It's actually reaching beyond Florida to New York and maybe internationally. You know, in cases like this, you have the possibility of individuals being lured into the United States under false pretenses with the hope of a better life, and then getting stuck living and working in a sweatshop or a brothel, having sex with strangers for money. And that's why conversations like this are so important, to shine the light on the evil of human trafficking, which is modern-day slavery. Which
really sort of answers the question. Some libertarians might ask, why waste your time on tracking down a bunch of lonely old men? This isn't just about that. It's about something much bigger, much darker, and that is, of course, the human trafficking side of things. Let me ask you about a rumor that everybody's heard. Everybody's called me all weekend, and everybody's talking about it online, that there's supposedly some rumor about some bigger fish out there, some bigger celebrity that's about to be caught, be announced. What can you tell us about that?
Well, it would be news to me, and there's not much I can say about rumors, especially the false ones.
So it would be news to you, then safe to say probably we can probably not expect a bigger name. Nick Confessori's with us in New York. Nick, do you have any questions?
Yeah, for Mimi, I want to ask you a question, Mimi. I was sort of struck by the way the sheriff in this investigation talked about the women being forced into work in this massage parlor as victims and not themselves the people doing something wrong. And we often see this debate in criminal justice circles about how the crime of prostitution often focuses on the women and not on the customers. Are we seeing, with the focus here on the men who are paying for the services of these trafficked women, allegedly, a change in focus and understanding where the focus of criminal justice should be in these cases?
Absolutely. That's a great question, Nick. And I think that the answer is yes. I think that shift really largely has occurred, certainly in the federal system, which I'm more familiar with, and I know in certain states, and it seems like Dave's office and in Florida, they certainly seem to have the right focus, because this is not about prostitution. This is about, as Dave said, human trafficking, sex slavery. I mean, it's not about women having sex with men. It's about men really raping women, essentially. And they think because they're paying for it, you know, it's somehow voluntary. But women like this who are brought here under false pretenses and essentially held in captivity because their passports are taken away, they can't communicate. I mean, David hit the nail on the head when he called it modern-day slavery. And I will say, you know, it's not dissimilar from another case that I know we might talk a little bit about, Jeffrey Epstein, He ran a sex trafficking ring, but it wasn't women from foreign countries. It was young, vulnerable girls here. And that is something that I saw very commonly in the federal system. It's happening in our backyards. Everyone should really have their eyes open about this. And those girls are not prostitutes, they're victims.
So let me ask you this, Dave. So far, no charges yet. As Mimi's talking about the human trafficking, you've been talking about the human trafficking. So far, no charges for anybody in on the human trafficking part of this sting. Why is it so hard to identify, charge, and prosecute human traffickers?
Silence is the enemy. Victims of human trafficking are subject to force, fraud, or coercion, and they're scared to speak up. They're scared of the traffickers sometimes because they may come from other countries. They're scared of the police because back in their home country, the police were part of the problem. And so there are resources available for these folks, and that's why it's so important to get them to speak up. That's why awareness can go a long way. Do you know at the federal level, there's something called a T visa. That's a special visa to allow victims of human trafficking to remain in this country. But people don't know about it. And so that's why it's so important, as Mimi said, that we have this conversation.
Mark
Casey.
Leibovich, what's the NFL going to do about this?
That's a great question. I mean, I think the NFL, look, regardless of how this is adjudicated in the courts, the NFL has a very, very strong need and a strong, desire to come down hard on an owner who is very high profile, especially on an issue involving women. And this is an issue that the NFL has struggled with, going back certainly to the Ray Rice issue of a few years ago. But look, the NFL, unlike a political party, they need everyone. They need to appeal to women. They need young people. They need Republicans. They need Democrats. And look, they have been seen as very lacking on this front. Robert Kraft is a very influential owner. He's a very high-profile owner, and he's someone who is not exactly beloved around the league among other owners. There's going to be a lot of pressure around Roger Goodell to actually do something and to actually make a statement, especially given how hard he's come down on a bunch of players.
Right, Mark. I wanted to follow up on that particular point. I mean, we've seen the NFL kind of embroiled in the question of players taking a knee as they protest the national anthem. And we know there's the morals clause, right, that this in some ways triggers, because it's not just simply soliciting prostitution. This is about human trafficking. I mean, this is as ugly as you can get. So do you think Goodell will have the courage, or the owners will have the courage, to at least strike the appearance of being morally consistent?
Yeah, I don't think it takes a whole lot of courage. I think it's something they actually want to do from a competitive standpoint. Again, I don't think there's a lot of goodwill towards Robert Kraft from a lot of them, partly because he's been beating them for all these years, or his team's been beating them for a lot of these years. So, I mean, it does get down to sort of that reductive way of looking at it at a certain point. But, yeah, no, I mean, it's a fairly easy call in some ways. I mean, it doesn't really hurt the Patriots. It's not like they're hurting their competitive position on the field. And I think you could see, a lot of pressure towards the commissioner to do something. And what's also interesting is that Robert Kraft hasn't done anything, or hasn't said anything since then. He was reportedly at the Oscars last night. There is a sort of nudge, wink, wink relationship to this. As, okay, he's just like sort of an old guy who, was a little lonely and maybe he paid for sex. Who cares? But you're right. I mean, there is a much larger, much broader, and much more sinister human trafficking and prostitution aspect to this that a lot of people are obviously focusing on, because he is such a high-profile, alleged John in this case.
So, Mimi, I want to ask you again about Jeffrey Epstein and connect it back to this case. So here we have, this is all alleged, obviously, right? But here we have a billionaire owner in the NFL and a wealthy financier in the Epstein case. Powerful men, well-connected, who are engaging in these crimes, allegedly. What does it say right now that these two men can now be finally getting some justice, or at least face the prospect of justice, despite their connections and their power?
Sure. So, I mean, look, I do think it's important to say first, obviously, that Kraft and Epstein are alleged, Epstein is found guilty of very different crimes. Kraft right now is not charged with running any sex trafficking ring, although I think it's just obvious from the descriptions there that even if he was in this place only twice, he should have known that something was going on here beyond just, his individual visits. But I think we are at a time, and remember, there's also R. Kelly. I mean, there are examples of powerful men now being held accountable in ways that they probably wouldn't have before. And I think that we have to give credit to the Me Too movement. You know, I think when one woman speaks up, or one girl, particularly when you're talking about people from other countries or young women, people don't believe them. And you need to have a chorus of voices. And I think that's what we're seeing here. You need to have law enforcement that really takes this seriously. I mean, that's the tragedy of the Epstein case to me as a former prosecutor, and I'm sure to someone like Dave, who seems to take this very seriously, that the justice system here did not do credit to those victims. They really, you know, sold this case out cheap, as far as I can tell. They cut the victims out of the process. I mean, it's just shameful. So I think what we are seeing now is people willing to listen and give the benefit of the doubt to victims more, and you're seeing a change in culture in law enforcement that really does take these crimes very seriously, as they should.
So, Dave, we saw a picture of Robert Kraft with Donald Trump. That reminds me, obviously, we're in the middle of a national emergency is declared by the President of the United States. And part of his justification have been stories about human trafficking across the border, and he goes into explicit detail of women being bound in the back of cars. What's actually the truth as a prosecutor? What can you tell us about the wall? Would it slow down human trafficking?
I think the wall would have a minimal impact in the fight against human trafficking, because most victims of human trafficking are actually Americans. They are American citizens or legal residents, and of the foreign nationals, most of them come in through ports of entry and other legal means. So the idea that women are being kidnapped at the border, thrown into a car with duct tape and rope, is actually more Hollywood than reality. And if you are focusing on the rope, if you are focusing on the duct tape, you're going to miss signs of human trafficking in plain sight, like the woman working at your nail salon who is not allowed to handle the cash, who is sleeping in the back room and is afraid to look at you in the eye, or the high school student with a new older boyfriend who buys her expensive jewelry and has his name tattooed on her eyelids. That's the reality of modern-day slavery.
All right, Dave Aronberg and Mimi Rocha, really appreciate it.